Struggling Cowboy brought home a baby. Not knowing it was his brother's child, Jake Calloway had lost everything. His cattle, his wife, his hope. But when he found a baby abandoned on his doorstep, he didn't know he was holding his brother's greatest betrayal or his own salvation. The dust had settled into everything. Jake Calloway's boots crunched across the hard-pan earth as he approached what remained of his ranch, the sound hollow in the dying light of another failed day. 3 months without rain. The creek bed stretched before him like a scar, white stones gleaming where water once ran clear and cold. His cattle, what few had survived the drought, were gone now, sold for less than half their worth to men who smiled with their teeth, but not their eyes. The house stood crooked against the evening sky, its windows dark as empty sockets. Martha's curtains still hung in the front room, though she'd been gone 6 weeks now. Packed her trunk one morning while he was mending fence, left a note on the kitchen table beside his cold coffee. Gonna live with my sister in town. Don't follow me, Jake. There's nothing left here worth saving. Maybe she was right. Maybe there never had been. Jake's horse nickered softly, sensing his exhaustion. He'd ridden hard from Millerville, where the bankman had given him 2 more weeks to settle his debts. 2 weeks to find money he didn't have, to save land that might not be worth saving. The weight of it pressed against his chest like a stone. He was halfway to the barn when he saw it. A bundle of cloth on his front porch, small and still against the weathered boards. Jake stopped walking. In this country, anything left on a man's doorstep could mean trouble. Could mean death. His hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, fingers closing around the familiar grip. But then the bundle moved. A tiny sound drifted across the yard, soft, desperate, human. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he climbed the porch steps, his spurs ringing against the wood. The bundle was wrapped in a faded blue blanket, the kind women made from old shirts when fabric was scarce. Inside, a baby looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed too old for such a small face. Jesus, Jake whispered. The child couldn't have been more than a few months old. His skin was flushed with fever, his tiny fists moving weakly against the blanket. Someone had left him here to die, or maybe to live, if Jake was man enough to try. A scrap of paper was tucked beneath the child, but the words were smeared beyond reading. Jake looked around the empty yard, his voice cracking as he called into the gathering darkness. "Hello? Anyone out there?" Only silence answered, the kind of silence that meant he was alone with a choice that would change everything. The baby made that sound again, not quite a cry, but close. Jake had never held an infant before. Never wanted to, but his hands were moving before his mind caught up, lifting the small weight against his chest. The child was burning with fever, light as a bird, fragile as glass. "All right," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "All right, little one." Inside the house, lamplight pushed back the shadows but couldn't chase away the emptiness. Jake's bachelor existence was written in every corner. Dirty plates stacked by the wash basin, clothes draped over chairs, the smell of loneliness thick as smoke. He'd been living like a man who'd given up, and now this child would see it all. The baby's cries grew stronger as Jake fumbled through Martha's abandoned things, searching for anything that might help. In the bottom of her trunk, he found a small blanket she'd been stitching, meant for a child that never came, a future that died with their marriage. Now it wrapped around this stranger son like a promise Jake wasn't sure he could keep. He heated milk on the stove, testing its warmth against his wrist the way he'd seen women do. The baby took it desperately, tiny hands grasping at Jake's thick fingers. As the child fed, his fever seemed to break, his breathing growing steady and deep. Jake found himself counting each breath, measuring his own heartbeat against the rhythm of this small life. "What am I going to do with you?" Jake asked the sleeping infant. Outside, coyotes called across the empty range, their voices sharp with hunger. He knew that sound too well, had carried it in his chest for months now, the ache of wanting what couldn't be had. But looking down at the child in his arms, Jake felt something shift. The baby's face was peaceful now, trusting in a way only the very young could trust. His features were delicate but strong, with a stubborn set to his jaw that reminded Jake of someone, though he couldn't place who. "Samuel," Jake said quietly, the name rising from somewhere deep inside him. "I'll call you Samuel." The baby's hand found Jake's thumb and held tight. Such a small grip, but it seemed to anchor something that had been drifting loose inside Jake's chest. He'd lost everything: his herd, his wife, his hope of making this land pay. But maybe losing everything was what it took to find what really mattered. He carried Samuel to the kitchen table where Martha used to serve their silent dinners. The chairs sat empty now, but Jake pulled one close and settled in with the baby against his shoulder. Through the window, stars appeared one by one in the endless sky, cold and distant as the promises he'd broken. "I don't have much to offer," Jake whispered against Samuel's soft hair. "But whatever I got, it's yours." The baby stirred in his sleep, and Jake felt the weight of a vow settling into his bones. Whatever had brought this child to his door, desperation, hope, or simple chance, Jake would not let him know hunger. Not the kind that hollowed out a man from the inside, leaving him empty as a dried well. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and distant storms. Change was coming. Jake could feel it in the air, in the small, warm weight against his chest. He didn't know yet what shape that change would take, or what prices it would demand. But for now, in the circle of lamplight, holding this unexpected gift, Jake Calloway began to remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting. For 3 months, Jake built a life around the abandoned baby, until his brother Thomas rode up and stared at the child like he was looking at a ghost or his own buried sins. 3 months passed, like seasons compressed into heartbeats. Jake's hands, once soft from easy living, grew hard again from honest work. He split wood for the widow Morrison, mended fence for old Pete Garrison, and hauled water for anyone willing to pay in coins or food. Every sunrise brought the same ritual: warming milk on the stove while Samuel stirred in the wooden crate that served as his cradle. The baby had grown strong under Jake's rough care. His fever never returned, and his dark eyes followed Jake's movements with an awareness that made the cowboy's chest tight with unexpected pride. Samuel would reach for Jake's face with tiny fingers, and Jake would find himself talking to the child about everything and nothing: the weather, the price of grain, the way morning light caught the dust motes dancing above their table. "You're getting heavy, boy," Jake would say as he lifted Samuel for his morning feeding. But he never complained. The weight felt good in his arms, solid and real in a way nothing else had for months. The house changed too. Jake cleared away the evidence of his bachelor despair, washed the dishes, swept the floors, hung clean clothes on the line Martha had abandoned. Not for any woman's approval, but because Samuel deserved better than the broken remains of a failed life. The baby's cries and coos filled the silence that had nearly driven Jake mad, and Jake found himself humming old songs he'd forgotten he knew. Money was scarce, but somehow there was always enough. Mrs. Chun at the general store would slip an extra can of milk into Jake's purchases, waving away his protests. "For the little one," she'd say, her weathered face soft with understanding. The whole town had heard about Jake Calloway and his foundling, and while some folks whispered about propriety and proper procedures, most saw what Jake saw: a child who needed protecting and a man who'd found his purpose. On warm afternoons, Jake would carry Samuel outside and show him the world that was slowly coming back to life. The creek still ran dry, but green shoots pushed up through the hardpan where rain had finally blessed the earth. Jake would hold the baby up to see the horses in the pasture, pointing out their different markings, telling stories about rides he'd taken and trails he'd followed. "That there's lightning," Jake would say, gesturing toward a paint mare. "She threw me 3 times before we came to an understanding. You got to respect a horse that knows her own mind." Samuel would gurgle and reach toward the animals, and Jake would imagine teaching him to ride, to rope, to read the signs that spelled weather and trouble across the endless sky. For the first time in years, Jake could see a future that stretched beyond the next payment, the next disaster, the next loss. But futures, Jake knew, had a way of arriving with their own complications. Thomas Calloway rode up on a Tuesday evening when the light was gold and the air smelled of sage. Jake was on the porch, feeding Samuel his supper, when he heard the familiar rhythm of his brother's horse. His stomach dropped like a stone down a well. 5 years. That's how long it had been since Thomas had darkened Jake's doorway. 5 years since the last time his younger brother had charmed his way into trouble and expected Jake to bail him out. Thomas looked the same, handsome in that easy way that made women trust him and men want to buy him drinks. His clothes were fine, his horse well-fed, his smile bright as new silver. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas called out as he swung down from his saddle. "Jake Calloway, family man." "Thomas." Jake's voice came out flat, careful. He pulled Samuel closer against his chest, suddenly protective in a way that surprised him. Thomas tied his horse to the porch rail and climbed the steps, his spurs ringing like small bells. But when he got close enough to see Samuel's face, he stopped. The easy smile faltered. His skin went pale beneath his tan. "Jesus Christ, Thomas Vispirit." Jake watched his brother's face, saw something there that made his blood run cold. Recognition. Fear. Guilt so thick it seemed to fill the air between them like smoke. "Something wrong, Thomas?" "Ew." "Nothing. Just." Thomas cleared his throat, forced his smile back into place. "Didn't expect to see you with a baby, is all." Martha finally come around to the idea. "Martha's gone. This here's Samuel. Found him 3 months back." Thomas couldn't stop staring at the child. His hand shook as he reached for his tobacco pouch, and Jake noticed his brother's fingers were soft as a gambler's. No calluses, no scars from honest work. "Found him where?" "Right here on this porch. Someone left him to die or live, depending on my charity. And you just kept him? What would you have done?" "Left him for the coyotes." Thomas rolled his cigarette with more care than the task required, his eyes still fixed on Samuel's face. The baby stared back with those dark, serious eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. "He's got a look about him," Thomas said quietly. "What kind of look?" "Familiar, I guess." "Can't place it." But Jake saw the lie in his brother's posture, heard it in the careful way Thomas wasn't quite meeting his eyes. Samuel reached out toward Thomas, making the soft sounds that usually made Jake smile. Instead, Jake found himself turning the baby away, shielding him from his brother's stare. "You staying for supper?" Jake asked, though every instinct told him to send Thomas riding back into the night. "If you'll have me." Been a long road from Amarillo. Inside, Jake heated beans and bacon while Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his presence too big for the small space Jake had made peaceful. Samuel fussed in his arms, and Jake found himself bouncing the baby, whispering soft words to calm him. But the child seemed to sense the tension, his small body rigid with unease. "You're good with him," Thomas observed. "He's easy to love." Something flickered across Thomas's face. Pain, regret, something darker. "Is he now?" They ate in silence, the only sound Samuel's quiet breathing and the scrape of spoons against tin plates. Outside, full darkness settled over the range, and Jake lit the lamp that had become as familiar as breathing. In its yellow glow, Samuel's features were soft and peaceful, and Jake felt that fierce protectiveness rise in his chest again. "Tell me about Amarillo," Jake said, more to break the silence than from real curiosity. "Oh, you know, cards, whiskey, women. Same as always." Thomas's laugh sounded forced. "Met a girl there, actually. Pretty little thing named Maria. Mexican. Sweet as honey cake." Jake's hand stilled on Samuel's back. Something in his brother's voice, in the way he said the name, made the hair on Jake's neck stand up. "What happened to her?" "Nothing happened. Just things got complicated. You know how it is." Jake didn't know, but he was beginning to suspect. Samuel stirred in his arms, and Jake looked down at the child he'd come to love more than his own life. The baby's features, soft in the lamplight, suddenly seemed to rearrange themselves into a pattern Jake recognized. The stubborn set of the jaw, the way his eyebrows drew together when he was thinking, the shape of his hands, all Calloway traits, all things Jake had seen in his own mirror, in old photographs of his father. All things he was seeing now in Thomas's guilty, frightened face. "Thomas," Jake said quietly, his voice steady as stone. How long ago did you leave Amarillo? His brother's cigarette trembled between his fingers. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like the sound of secrets trying to get out. When Thomas finally confessed that Samuel was his son, abandoned by a desperate mother he'd fled from, Jake realized that blood didn't make a man a father, but walking away from your child made you a coward. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jake felt them settle into his bones, heavy and final as dirt on a coffin lid. Outside, the wind had grown teeth, howling across the empty range with a sound like grief itself. For months, Thomas whispered, his cigarette forgotten between his fingers. I left Amarillo 4 months ago. Jake looked down at Samuel, sleeping peaceful in his arms, tiny fingers curled against his chest. For months. The numbers lined up like a judgment, cold and precise. The baby's age, his features, the timing of Thomas's departure, all of it fitting together like pieces of a puzzle Jake had been too blind to see. Her name was Maria Delgado, Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Worked at the cantina where I played cards. Prettiest thing you ever saw, with these dark eyes that made you forget your own name. Smart too and kind. Too kind for a man like me. Jake said nothing. He couldn't trust his voice, couldn't trust the rage building in his chest like a storm about to break. Samuel stirred in his sleep, and Jake's arms tightened protectively around the small body. She told me about the baby on a Tuesday. I remember because it was the day I'd won big at poker, felt like the luckiest man alive. Then she said those words, I'm carrying your child, and all that luck just dried up, like water in the desert. So you ran? Jake's voice came out flat, emotionless. I wasn't ready to be a father. Hell, I'm still not ready. You know me, Jake. I'm not the settling type. Never have been. And Maria? Thomas flinched like Jake had struck him. She was stronger than I gave her credit for. Kept working at the cantina, even when she started showing. The other girls helped her, and old Carlos, he owned the place. He let her stay in the room upstairs. But after the baby came, after Samuel came, she tried, Jake. God knows she tried. But she was just a girl herself, barely 19. No family, no husband, no money for a doctor when the baby got sick. And Carlos, he was patient for a while, but a crying infant isn't good for business. Jake stood up slowly, Samuel cradled against his shoulder. He walked to the window and stared out at the darkness, trying to see past his own reflection to something that made sense. The land stretched away from the house, like a promise that had been broken too many times. She brought him here. It wasn't a question. Must have. Somehow she found out where I came from, where my family lived. Carlos probably told her. He knew I had a brother in Texas. She must have ridden for days with his sick baby, hoping what? That you'd grown a conscience. Hoping someone would love her child enough to keep him alive. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He turned from the window, fury blazing in his chest. Her child? That's what you call him? Her child. Jake. He's your son, Thomas. Your blood. Your responsibility. And you left him to die on a stranger's doorstep because you were too much of a coward to face what you'd done. Thomas stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. I came back, didn't I? I'm here now, ready to do the right thing. The right thing. Jake's laugh was bitter as alkali water. The right thing was staying in Amarillo. The right thing was holding Maria's hand when your son was born. The right thing was being a man instead of a selfish boy who runs when life gets complicated. I know I made mistakes. Jake's voice rose, and Samuel stirred in his arms, sensing the tension. Jake forced himself to speak quieter, but his words carried the weight of judgment. You didn't make mistakes, Thomas. You made choices. You chose to seduce a girl barely out of childhood. You chose to abandon her when she needed you most. You chose to let your own son nearly die of fever rather than face the consequences of your actions. Thomas's face crumpled like paper in a fire. I was scared, Jake. Scared and stupid and young. Maria was younger than you. She was scared too, but she didn't run. I'm not running now. I want to take him, raise him proper. Give him my name. Jake stepped closer, and Thomas instinctively backed away. The lamplight caught the tears on his brother's face, But Jake felt no pity, only a cold, protective fury that burned like winter fire. You want to take him where? Back to your cards and whiskey and women? Back to that rootless life where nothing matters but your own pleasure. I've got money now. I could settle down, buy a place. With what? Holt will go winnings. Money you'll lose at the next table when the cards turn cold. Thomas pulled out a thick roll of bills from his jacket, holding it like a peace offering. I've got enough to give him everything he needs. Ductos schooling, a real oma, as a real oma. He has someone who loves him more than his own life. What he doesn't need is a father who shows up with guilt money and promises he can't keep. Jake moved to the kitchen table where he'd fed Samuel countless meals, where he'd watched the boy learn to smile, to laugh, to trust. The simple wooden surface held the weight of memory, of daily devotions that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. You know what, out of the first night, I found him? Jake asked quietly. I sat right here in this chair and promised him he'd never know hunger. Not the kind that eats you from the inside out, makes you desperate enough to do anything for a scrap of hope. I've kept that promise for 3 months, Thomas. 3 months of working every day, selling everything I owned, going without so he could have what he needed. I can pay you back. This isn't about money. Jake's voice was steady now, certain as the sunrise. It's about showing up. It's about being there when he's sick at 2 in the morning. It's about teaching him right from wrong, about being the kind of man he can look up to without shame. Thomas sank back into his chair, the fight gone out of him. He's my son. No, Jake said quietly, Samuel's weight solid and warm against his chest. Blood doesn't make you a father. Love does. Sacrifice does. Staying when it's hard, when you're tired, when the whole world seems set against you. That's what makes you a father. The silence stretched between them, heavy with truth and sorrow. Outside, the wind had died down, and Jake could hear the distant sound of coyotes calling to their pack. Family voices in the darkness, bound by more than blood. I could fight you for him, Thomas said finally. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun, then stopped. Violence wouldn't solve this. Samuel needed peace, not more abandonment. You could try. But ask yourself, what kind of man fights for a child he's never held? What kind of father starts his relationship with his son by tearing him away from the only home he's known? Thomas looked up at his brother, his face aged by guilt and regret. What am I supposed to do, Jake? Lie with this weight for the rest of my life? Yes, Jake said simply. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. You carry it, and you learn from it, and maybe someday you become the kind of man who deserves to be called father. Samuel opened his eyes then, as if he'd been listening to every word. He looked up at Jake with that serious, trusting gaze that had become the center of Jake's world. Then his tiny face broke into the smile that could light up the darkest room, and Jake felt his heart crack open with love and fierce protectiveness. Thomas saw it too. The look between them, the bond that couldn't be broken by blood or law or money. His shoulders sagged as the truth settled into his bones like winter cold. He's happy, Thomas said, and it sounded like a prayer. He's loved, Jay corrected. The lamplight flickered between them, casting shadows that danced like ghosts of all the choices that had led them to this moment. Outside, dawn was still hours away, but Jake could feel it coming, the light that would show them all what they'd become in the darkness. Jake had a choice. Stay and fight his brother for a child that wasn't his by blood, or disappear into the dawn with the boy who'd become his son in every way that mattered. The darkness before dawn held a different quality than the darkness of night. It whispered of endings and beginnings, of choices that couldn't be undone. Jake sat in his chair by the window, Samuel sleeping against his chest, watching the horizon for the first hint of light that would show him what path to take. Thomas had passed out at the kitchen table, his head pillowed on his arms, empty whiskey bottle beside him like a faithful companion. The money he'd offered still lay scattered across the wooden surface. More cash than Jake had seen in years, but worthless as fool's gold when weighed against what really mattered. Jake's decision had been made in the quiet hours after midnight, formed not in anger, but in the deep certainty that came from knowing love. He rose carefully, Samuel never stirring in his arms, and began to gather their few belongings with the silent efficiency of a man who'd learned to travel light. Into his old saddlebags went Samuel's clothes, tiny shirts sewn from Jake's own worn fabrics, small pants patched with love rather than skill. The wooden horse Jake had carved with trembling hands during Samuel's first fever. The tin cup that had held countless meals. The blue blanket that had wrapped around hope itself on that first desperate night. From his trunk, Jake took his father's letters, the only inheritance that mattered, and the daguerreotype of his parents on their wedding day. Samuel would need to know where he came from, even if that knowledge came with complicated truths. Jake folded everything carefully, his movements deliberate as prayer. The lamp flickered as he moved around the small house, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed his transformation from broken man to devoted father. This place had seen his worst moments and his best, had sheltered his despair and nurtured his hope. But houses were just wood and nails. Home was what you carried with you. In the kitchen, Jake tore a page from Martha's old recipe book and wrote with careful letters, "Thomas, some debts can't be paid with money or regret. Samuel is my son now, chosen and claimed, and I'll not see him used to ease your guilt or fill the emptiness you've made of your life. Don't follow us. If you want to honor his mother's memory, become the kind of man she deserved to love. Maybe someday you'll understand what it means to be a father." Jake, he left the note beside the scattered bills, weighed down with his father's old pocket watch, the only thing of value he'd ever owned. Tom had run out on this life, anyway. Samuel woke as Jake carried him to the barn, blinking up at his father with those dark, trusting eyes. The baby didn't cry, just made soft sounds as if he understood they were going on an adventure. Jake saddled his horse by feel, hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was choosing. "We're going to see the mountains, boy," Jake whispered as he fashioned a sling to carry Samuel close to his chest. "There's work up there for men who aren't afraid of honest labor. Timber cutting, maybe some mining, clean air and clean water, and nobody asking questions about where you came from." The horse nickered softly, sensing the journey ahead. Jake led her out of the barn and into the pre-dawn darkness, her hooves muffled on the hard earth. Behind them, the house sat silent as a tombstone, holding the ghosts of all the men Jake had been before love taught him who he was meant to become. They rode west toward the mountains, following the old cattle trail Jake had taken countless times in his younger days. The land rolled away beneath them like a prayer, vast and forgiving under the star-scattered sky. Samuel dozed against Jake's chest, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the steady beat of his father's heart. As the first pale edge of dawn touched the horizon, Jake began to talk, not to pass the time, but to fill the silence with the sound of family. He told Samuel about his grandfather, who'd carved their name into the land with sweat and stubbornness, about the grandmother who'd sewn quilts by lamplight and sung lullabies in a voice like honey and smoke. "Your blood father, he's got charm and good looks and quick hand with cards," Jake said as they climbed into the foothills. "But those aren't the things that make a man. What makes a man is staying when staying is hard. It's working when you're tired, sacrificing when you've got nothing left to give, loving when love demands everything you are." The sun rose behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Jake can look back. The past was a country he'd already visited too many times, and the future stretched ahead like an open door. Somewhere in those mountains, there would be work for a man with strong hands and a strong back. There would be a place where Samuel could grow up knowing he was wanted, chosen, claimed by love rather than accident of birth. "I'll teach you to read," Jake promised as they rode deeper into the wilderness. Not just words on a page, but the signs that spell weather across the sky, the tracks that tell stories in the dust. "I'll teach you to respect the land and the creatures that share it with us." Samuel stirred in his sling, tiny hand reaching up to touch Jake's face. The gesture was simple, trusting, and it hit Jake with the force of revelation. This child would never know abandonment, would never wonder if he was worthy of love, would never feel the hollow ache of being left behind by someone who should have stayed. The mountains grew larger as they rode, their peaks touched with snow even in the warmth of early summer. Jake had heard there were settlements up there, places where a man could build a cabin with his own hands and raise a child to know the difference between right and wrong. Towns where your past mattered less than your willingness to work, to contribute, to be the kind of neighbor folks could depend on. "We'll build something good up there," Jake said, his voice steady with certainty. "Something that can't be taken away by drought or debt or the mistakes of other men. We'll build a life worth living." The trail wound higher, following ancient deer paths through stands of pine and aspen. The air grew thin and clean, scented with snow and possibility. Behind them, the flatlands stretched away like a memory, holding all the sorrow and failure Jake was leaving behind. Ahead, the mountains waited with their promise of new beginnings. By midday, they'd climbed high enough to see the world spread out below them, a patchwork of ranch land and wild country, roads leading in every direction like lines of fate. Jake stopped his horse at a meadow where wildflowers bloomed in defiant beauty, their colors bright against the green grass. He dismounted and walked to a stream that ran clear and cold from the high peaks. Samuel laughed at the sound of rushing water, his first real laugh Jake had heard, pure and joyful as church bells. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and came back to them transformed, multiplied, as if the whole world was celebrating this moment of perfect happiness. Jake knelt by the stream and let the mountain water run over his hands. It was so cold it made his fingers ache, but it was clean, cleaner than anything he'd known in the dusty flatlands. He cupped some in his palm and let Samuel touch it, watching wonder bloom in the child's dark eyes. "This is where we start over," Jake said quietly. "Just you and me, boy. No ghosts, no guilt, no looking back. Just the future we're going to build with our own hands." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow and endless sky. It spoke of freedom, of choices that led not to regret but to redemption. Jake stood and lifted Samuel high, showing him the vast country that stretched away in every direction. "All of this belongs to you now," he said. "Not because you were born to it, but because you're loved enough to inherit it. That's the only birthright that matters, son. The only one that can't be taken away." Samuel reached toward the sky with both small hands, grasping at clouds and possibilities. In that gesture, Jake saw the future, saw the man this boy would become, raised on love instead of abandonment, shaped by sacrifice instead of selfishness. It was a future worth every mile they'd traveled, every bridge they'd burned, every comfort they'd left behind. The sun climbed toward noon as they rode deeper into their new country, father and son bound by something stronger than blood, richer than gold, more enduring than the mountains themselves. Behind them, the old life grew small and distant. Ahead, everything waited to be discovered, to be claimed, to be loved into existence by two hearts that had found each other in the darkness and chosen light. In the distance, smoke rose from a chimney, their first glimpse of the community that would become their home. Jake urged his horse forward, Samuel safe against his chest, carrying them both toward the life they would build together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time.